What if the history we've been taught isn't the full story? What if the monuments we admire today weren't just architectural achievements, but technological messages from a world far more advanced than we imagine? Today, I want you to walk with me into the shadows of the past, into the strange stories behind two of the most iconic structures on Earth, the Eiffel Tower and the Crystal Palace. You probably know them as wonders of engineering, but what if they're actually signs of something else, something our textbooks never really explain? Let's start with the Eiffel Tower. When people think of Paris, they imagine this iron giant, a monument that defines the city. But very few stop to question how such a structure was built with the precision, the scale, and the speed at which it appeared. According to official history, the Eiffel Tower was built between 1887 and 1889 in just over 2 years. 2 years to build a 1,000-foot iron lattice tower using over 18,000 metal parts, all supposedly hand-riveted in place. That timeline alone sounds like a miracle, but the more you look into it, the stranger it becomes. The planners of the tower weren't just building a tourist attraction. They claimed the tower was an engineering test, an experiment in wind resistance and structural efficiency. But the deeper you dig into old archives, engineering sketches, and public reactions from that era, the more you sense that something doesn't add up. Even contemporary engineers admitted they didn't fully understand how it could remain so stable. Some even said its resilience was unexplainable. So the question becomes, were they truly building something new, or were they reconstructing something they didn't fully understand? Because here's the twist. Illustrations of strikingly similar towers appear in engravings and drawings from centuries earlier. These images don't show the Eiffel Tower exactly, but they do show tall, lattice-like towers, often connected with stories of energy, atmospheric electricity, and ancient knowledge. Is it possible that the Eiffel Tower is not simply a triumph of 19th century engineering, but instead a reawakening of forgotten technology? Now, before you think this is all conspiracy, let's look at the facts. Gustav Eiffel was not just a builder. He was deeply involved in scientific research, particularly radio waves and atmospheric electricity. At the top of the tower, he installed equipment designed to measure electrical conditions in the atmosphere. In fact, the Eiffel Tower was one of the tallest electrical conductors ever created at the time. Even today, scientists note how odd its design is for a monument, but how perfect it is for capturing electrical energy. So was it really created for tourism? Or was it a device, a giant tool for harnessing or studying energy? Now let's shift from iron to glass, from the Eiffel Tower to something equally mysterious, the Crystal Palace. The Crystal Palace was built in 1851 in London, supposedly created in less than a year. Think about that. A structure covering over 990,000 square feet, almost 1,000,000 square feet, built from iron and glass during a period when even producing glass at scale was a difficult and slow process. Yet somehow this structure rose from the ground like a giant shimmering greenhouse, larger than anything the world had ever seen. The official story says it was built for the Great Exhibition, a kind of world fair. But the strange part is how it was built. Joseph Paxton, the designer, had never worked on anything even remotely close to that size. Yet supposedly, he woke up one morning, drew a sketch, and within months this colossal structure was standing. But here's the part that people rarely talk about. The Crystal Palace looked nothing like traditional Victorian architecture. Instead, it looked like something futuristic, something out of a sci-fi movie. Massive geometric glass patterns, modular iron components, and an almost biological elegance that resembles a technologically advanced greenhouse.
And it's not just the design, it's the speed. Construction started in July 1850, and by May 1851, it was ready to host millions of visitors. This building was so large and so precise that even modern engineers marvel at how quickly it came together. Many wonder whether the capabilities simply didn't match 19th century industrial tech. Now here's where things get even more intriguing. When the Crystal Palace was dismantled decades later, workers reported strange things. Parts that didn't match the official blueprints, metal beams that were lighter than they should have been, and glass that had unusual refractive qualities. Some pieces were lost or taken, and to this day, the full structure cannot be replicated using the same materials and timeline. So what does that mean? Was the Crystal Palace an example of forgotten or rediscovered technology? Was it built using techniques not recorded in our history? Or could it have been constructed using knowledge inherited from an earlier civilization, one that knew how to manipulate metal, glass, and energy in ways we barely understand today? Now let's connect the dots between the Eiffel Tower and the Crystal Palace, because the similarities are too striking to ignore. Both were massive structures made of iron. Both were built at incredible speed. Both used modular parts, almost like they were assembled from kits rather than handcrafted piece by piece. Both became symbols of power, yet both also had purposes that went beyond beauty or engineering. And most importantly, both appeared during an era when the world was supposedly transitioning from primitive technology to industrial-era innovation. But what if that's not the full story? What if these structures were remnants of or attempts to recreate technology from an earlier civilization, one that knew how to manipulate metal, glass, and energy in ways we barely understand today? Throughout history, we've seen monuments that don't match the knowledge of the civilizations that supposedly built them. The Great Pyramids, the Baalbek stones, Pula Punku, ancient temples with stones cut so precisely they look like they were carved by laser. Every generation looks at these relics and wonders how ancient builders achieved such perfection. But we rarely consider that some modern structures may fall into the same category. The Eiffel Tower doesn't just look like an energy conductor, it acts like one. Its shape, its materials, its height, its grounding, everything about it is optimized not for tourism, but for atmospheric experimentation. Gustave Eiffel even said he believed the tower could be part of future technologies. What did he mean by that? And the Crystal Palace didn't just display objects. The environment inside it had effects people recorded at the time. Unusual warmth, plants that grew faster, strange acoustics, and light that scattered in unnatural patterns through the glass. Was it simply architecture? Or was it an experiment with energy, growth, and environmental control? If we stop assuming the official story is complete, a new picture forms, one where these structures are not isolated wonders, but part of a pattern where unexplained precision, impossible timelines, and energy-related properties appear again and again. A pattern suggesting that history may have gaps filled with forgotten knowledge, erased events, or civilizations whose remains are hiding in plain sight. And that leaves us with a haunting question. What if the Eiffel Tower and the Crystal Palace were not the beginning of a new age, but the last echoes of an old one?
Imagine walking through the 19th century, a time we're told was defined by coal smoke, horse-drawn carts, and early machines just beginning to evolve. Now, imagine suddenly encountering two structures, the Eiffel Tower and the Crystal Palace, that look like they fell out of a future timeline. Iron lattices stretching 1,000 feet into the sky, shimmering glass megastructures covering entire city blocks, modular metals perfectly fitted, and construction speeds that rival or even exceed our modern standards. When you place these monuments against their historical backdrop, they don't just stand out, they feel impossible. So let's continue the journey, and this time Let's dig even deeper into the forgotten technologies, hidden historical anomalies, and the strange coincidences that connect these two marvels. Let's return first to the Eiffel Tower. As we consider its design, one detail jumps out: the precision of its iron lattice. The tower's 18,038 individual metal pieces were manufactured off-site, then transported and assembled like a massive metallic puzzle with almost no adjustments needed on-site. For a structure built in the 1880s, this level of precision is baffling. The tolerances between parts were so narrow that even modern engineers with computer modeling would find such accuracy impressive. Yet somehow, this was achieved with no computers, no digital tools, and supposedly with nothing more than basic industrial-age machinery. Here is where things become even stranger. Gustav Eiffel claimed that every piece of the iron structure was calculated mathematically to distribute weight and wind pressure in the most efficient way possible. But his equations he references in his historical documents are oddly incomplete. They point to formulas that weren't fully developed until decades later. Some historians even admit that the mathematics he used feels ahead of its time. So what does that imply? Is it possible that Eiffel himself was working with knowledge he did not originate, knowledge that may have been rediscovered rather than invented? Because if the tower was just a tourist attraction or engineering demonstration, why design it with such extreme mathematical precision? Why treat it like a scientific instrument rather than simply a monument? And speaking of scientific instruments, let's talk about one of the Eiffel Tower's least discussed mysteries: its early use as an electrical and atmospheric research device. When the tower was completed, Eiffel didn't just admire it. He immediately installed multiple laboratories on different levels. One was dedicated to meteorology, another was dedicated to studying wind resistance. But the most fascinating lab focused on atmospheric electricity. Eiffel scientists conducted experiments involving electrical charges in the atmosphere, radio wave propagation, and transmission of signals. Some believe the tower was originally designed with these experiments in mind rather than as a tourist attraction. If we take that idea seriously, then the Eiffel Tower becomes less like a monument and more like a gigantic antenna, or even a receiver or transmitter for natural Earth energy. And now the story begins to echo something we've heard before. For centuries, legends have described ancient civilizations harnessing atmospheric energy. Nikola Tesla himself, decades after the tower was built, experimented with similar ideas: wireless transmission of energy, resonant frequencies, ionospheric electricity. Tesla even commented on the Eiffel Tower, suggesting it was a near-perfect structure for electrical resonance. So now the question becomes impossible to ignore. Why did a 19th-century monument accidentally resemble one of the most advanced electrical instruments ever theorized? Was it an accident? Coincidence? Or was the design inspired by knowledge we don't fully understand? Now let's turn our focus back to the Crystal Palace. On the surface, it appears to be a completely different kind of structure. But beneath the shimmering glass lies a mystery just as profound. The Crystal Palace wasn't just big. It was enormous. Covering nearly 1 million square feet, it was a forest of iron columns and glass sheets forming a perfect geometric grid. But there's a detail most people overlook. The entire structure was modular. Every column, beam, and pane of glass was designed to be manufactured off-site, transported, and rapidly assembled on location. This modular construction is incredibly modern. Factories today use similar techniques for assembling skyscrapers, but in 1850, the idea seems almost impossible. More than that, consider the sheer amount of glass required. Victorian glass production was slow and expensive, Yet somehow, manufacturers were able to produce hundreds of thousands of identical glass panes quickly and perfectly. How? Did the Victorians have a method of mass-producing glass that has since been lost? Or did they discover abandoned techniques or machinery? Now, here's an even stranger mystery. When the Crystal Palace was reconstructed in 1854 in Sidham, researchers noticed modifications that didn't match Paxton's original designs. Some historians believe sections were rebuilt using parts that came from older structures, not newly manufactured ones. Could they have been recycling components from a civilization predating Victorian London? This idea seems extreme until you recognize that the Victorians often repurposed ancient materials without documenting their origins. But let's shift from structure to function. Inside the Crystal Palace, something unusual happened. Visitors reported sensations of warmth even on cold days. They described the atmosphere as charged and almost unnatural. Some plants inside the exhibition halls grew faster than expected, and many commented on the strange acoustics. Sounds seemed amplified or softened depending on where you stood. Scientists today understand that glass structures can trap certain wavelengths of light and heat, creating microclimates. But Victorian engineers did not have the modern understanding of thermodynamics to intentionally design such effects. So were these features intentional, or were they remnants of an older purpose? Could the Crystal Palace have been a kind of environmental control structure, part greenhouse, part energy conductor, part atmospheric experiment? When you place the Eiffel Tower and Crystal Palace side by side, a pattern emerges. Both are made from modular parts. Both were built bewilderingly fast. Both relied on industrial capabilities that exceeded their era. And both interacted with light, atmosphere, or electricity in ways that seem almost deliberate. So let's dig into the bigger theory, one that connects them directly. During the 19th century, Europe and America experienced something historians call the Industrial Explosion. But what if this wasn't simply a period of invention? Instead, what if it was a period of rediscovery? Many artifacts, machines, and technologies were unearthed during this era. Old texts were translated, strange devices were found in ancient ruins, and in the chaos of rapid industrialization, it's possible some knowledge was quietly adopted, claimed, and repurposed. Imagine if the 19th century wasn't the birth of modern technology, but the reboot. If so, then monuments like the Eiffel Tower and Crystal Palace take on a new meaning. They are not anomalies, they are fingerprints, evidence of a transition period where humanity was rediscovering old methods of working with metal, energy, and atmospheric forces. Let's go deeper into this idea. Historians often struggle to explain why so many architectural styles emerged suddenly in the 1800s. Not gradually, but explosively. Neoclassical, Gothic revival, industrial ironwork, scientific structures, buildings that looked ancient mixed with buildings that looked futuristic. It's almost as if architects and engineers were drawing from multiple lost traditions simultaneously. Consider this. Before the Eiffel Tower, no one had built anything like it. After the tower, skyscrapers quickly followed. Before the Crystal Palace, glass megastructures were unheard of. After it, they spread across Europe and America. Why the sudden mastery of iron and glass? Why these specific materials? Why these geometries? And why at this moment in history? Some researchers propose that during this era, humanity uncovered or reinterpreted relics from a lost civilization, one that understood atmospheric energy, iron resonance, and optical structures far better than we do. And instead of revealing this discovery, governments and industrialists may have quietly integrated the ideas into modern development. This isn't just speculation. There are strange historical anomalies that support this possibility. For example, in the mid-1800s, excavation efforts in London uncovered deep layers of brickwork and tunnels far older than expected. In Paris, workers building new foundations discovered ancient metal frameworks buried underground. In South America, explorers found rust-resistant iron artifacts whose metallurgical composition doesn't match known ancient techniques. These findings rarely make the history books, but they could hint at a forgotten technological lineage. If the Eiffel Tower and Crystal Palace were influenced by such discoveries, they become part of a larger narrative, a narrative where the past is not just older than we think, but more advanced. Now let's return to the Eiffel Tower's scientific aspects because this is where things get even more intriguing. When Eiffel began atmospheric experiments, he noticed something unusual. The tower resonated, not physically but electrically. Instruments recorded fluctuations in charge that were independent of weather patterns. At certain times of day, the tower's electrical potential increased dramatically, almost as if it was absorbing or channeling energy from the atmosphere. This phenomenon still occurs today. Modern scientists have measured electrical fields around the tower that don't align with surrounding conditions. Some speculate that the tower is interacting with the ionosphere in ways we don't fully understand. And that leads to a stunning possibility. The Eiffel Tower might be acting as a passive energy receiver, like an ancient obelisk or conductive spire rediscovered and rebuilt in modern form. What about the Crystal Palace? Could it also have served an energetic function? Glass is not just transparent. It also refracts, diffuses, and absorbs energy. When arranged in geometric patterns, it can manipulate light and heat in sophisticated ways. The Crystal Palace's repeating hexagonal and rectangular patterns create lens-like effects. When sunlight hit the structure, it did more than illuminate, it transformed the environment inside. Many visitors reported feeling uplifted, energized, even euphoric. Scientists today might explain that through infrared patterns, ionization, or natural light therapy. But Victorian builders had such knowledge, so how did they accidentally create a building that acted like a giant energy amplifier? Or was it not an accident at all? Maybe the Crystal Palace was inspired by something older, some ancient greenhouse, temple, or energy structure whose purpose we've forgotten. Maybe Paxton stumbled upon old sketches or ruins that sparked his design. Maybe his water lily inspiration story was simply the public version. As we journey further, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. Buildings like these don't just happen. They emerge at key moments with suspicious speed, precision, and design intelligence. Which brings us to a bigger question. What if the Eiffel Tower and Crystal Palace were part of an earlier global system, one that used architecture to channel natural energy? Ancient cultures often aligned structures with stars, energy lines, and atmospheric currents. Egyptian pyramids, Mayan temples, Indian stupas, Chinese pagodas. These buildings weren't just symbolic, they were functional. If this ancient system once existed, then the Eiffel Tower and Crystal Palace may not be outliers. They may be modern-era reconstructions of older principles. The Eiffel Tower becomes a modern obelisk. The Crystal Palace becomes a modern light temple. Iron becomes a resonant conductor. Glass becomes a frequency manipulator. Architecture becomes technology. Now the story becomes much larger than two monuments. And yet, we still haven't confronted the biggest question. If the Eiffel Tower and Crystal Palace truly reflect lost knowledge, then where did that knowledge come from? Was it human, pre-human, or something else entirely? To answer that, We need to explore hidden records, ancient legends, unexplained artifacts, and technological impossibilities from around the world. If we truly want to understand whether history is incomplete, if we want to know whether the structures of the 19th century point to something far older, then we must look beyond the monuments and into the people who were connected to them. Because sometimes the real clues are not in steel or glass, but in the stories of the men who supposedly built them, funded them, or documented them. And when we follow those connections, the narrative becomes even stranger. Let's begin with a man whose name appears around almost every impossible building of the 19th century, yet whose life story has giant missing chapters. Prince Albert, the husband of Queen Victoria. The Crystal Palace was his dream project. He pushed it, protected it, shaped it. But what made it even stranger is that Albert, who was never trained as an architect, engineer, or industrial designer, somehow seemed to know exactly what he wanted, down to the smallest technical detail. In his personal letters, he described the building as if he understood advanced thermal regulation, structural load distribution, and modular glass casting processes far beyond the knowledge of his time. He wasn't just picking colors and curtains. He was talking like someone who had seen this kind of structure before. Which raises the question, how does a man with no architectural training confidently design one of the most mathematically precise buildings in modern history? Unless he wasn't designing it. He was remembering it, or following something, or rediscovering something that already existed. And then, just as the building became a global phenomenon, Prince Albert died at only 42 years old under mysterious medical circumstances that historians still debate today. And after his death, the Crystal Palace, his greatest achievement, slowly became unwanted, undervalued, and finally destroyed. A structure ahead of its time, created by a man who shouldn't have known how to create it, erased under suspicious conditions. Coincidence? Maybe. But the Eiffel Tower story leads to the same pattern. Gustave Eiffel, the man who supposedly invented the design, spent decades defending himself from accusations that he had plagiarized the tower. Several scientists insisted that Eiffel stole their ideas. Others said the tower was mathematically incompatible with the engineering tools of the era. Eiffel himself admitted that many of the tower's structural concepts were not his, but came from a team of unnamed mathematicians whose notes were mysteriously lost after the tower was finished. And Eiffel lived long enough to see the tower nearly demolished multiple times, which terrified him because he knew more than anyone that this structure was not just a tourist attraction, it was a statement, a clue, a symbol of technological knowledge that did not match its century. And then, as photography advanced after the 1880s, early photos of Paris began disappearing, photos that supposedly showed the massive foundries and factories needed to build a 10,000-ton steel tower. Except those factories don't appear anywhere. The machines don't appear. The workers don't appear. The supply chains don't appear. It's like Paris built the world's largest tower without leaving any footprints behind. It's like the tower was already there, or built using methods we no longer understand. But here is where everything becomes truly shocking. Paris and London are not the only cities with these anomalies. If you look around the world, the same pattern repeats over and over. Massive steel domes from the 1800s with no documented equipment capable of bending metal arcs that large. Gigantic glass train stations with sheets of glass that modern manufacturers still can't replicate at that scale. Cathedrals with resonance chambers designed like acoustic machines rather than places of worship. Cast iron pillars in India that do not rust after 1,600 years. Pagan temples in Mexico aligned with solar geometry that would require satellites to map today. Different continents, different cultures, same impossible precision. Either humanity repeatedly got lucky, or we are missing an entire chapter of technological history. And then we get to the greatest puzzle of all. Where did the knowledge suddenly go? Why would a civilization capable of building structures like these lose all ability to replicate them? Why didn't anyone rebuild the Crystal Palace? Why can't we create a second Eiffel Tower without using modern computers, which they supposedly didn't have? Why did the world suddenly forget? Maybe because these structures weren't built by the civilizations that inherited them. Maybe they were remnants of a lost technological age. Maybe the 1800s were not the beginning, but the end of something. And the Industrial Revolution wasn't an explosion of new technology. It was a desperate attempt to reverse engineer old technology. Look carefully at the architecture of 19th century buildings, the star-shaped floor plans, the resonant domes, the metallic ornaments that resemble electrical conductors, the symmetry that mirrors electromagnetic field patterns. It looks more like circuitry than decoration, more like machines than monuments. Many researchers today wonder whether these buildings were not merely beautiful, they were functional. Maybe they harvested atmospheric electricity. Maybe they regulated temperature without fuel. Maybe they purified air using resonance. Maybe entire cities used energy systems we no longer understand. And when you remove energy from a civilization, that civilization collapses. Its greatest structures become useless. Its knowledge becomes irrelevant. Its technology becomes myths. So the Eiffel Tower and the Crystal Palace may not just be historical wonders. They may be survivors. Fragments of a forgotten world. Artifacts from a technological timeline that no longer exists. Clues pointing to the possibility that humanity has risen and fallen not once, but many times. Maybe the history we read in textbooks is the story of the last reset, not the first one. And maybe, just maybe, we are only now beginning to rediscover what the world once knew. Because technology doesn't always move forward. Sometimes it disappears. Sometimes it gets erased. And sometimes it hides in plain sight, standing tall in the heart of Paris or shattered in the fields of London, waiting for us to finally ask the right question. What if history is wrong? And what if the truth was always above us?